Today we are going to talk about trauma through the eyes of a young child and ways to support resilience. That is, when a young child is impacted by trauma, what are some of the ways that we can help support them to be able to recover and be okay following the traumatic experience? We're talking about very young children, so it's important to understand the principles of infant and early childhood mental health. Infant mental health is the developing capacity of the child from birth to 3 to essentially be able to regulate their emotions and express them, to be able to form close and secure relationships. As the relationships become more secure and they're more secure in their environment, to be able to explore and learn. And all of this takes place in the context of family, community, and culture, all of which are extremely important for the young child's mental health or behavioral health. That is, what we mean is a young child's being able to develop in an optimal way. The 0 to 3 Infant Mental Health Task Force came up with these ideas a number of years ago and has continued to modify them. Let's talk about the definition of trauma. I feel it's very important for us all to be on the same page to understand what we're talking about. Trauma is an event that overwhelms the child's ability to cope. It causes fear, helplessness. Sometimes the child becomes sad or withdrawn or disorganized or agitated. And trauma is not only caused by experiencing, but also by witnessing an event. And the event would have a real or perceived threat to the child or to someone close to them. So they would feel overwhelmed and find it difficult to manage on their own. Children are traumatized in a lot of different ways. We hear a lot, particularly for those who work in the child welfare area, about physical abuse and sexual abuse and neglect. And in fact, the majority of the children in the child welfare system become part of that system because of neglect. And then not infrequently we see physical abuse, sometimes sexual abuse, occurring concurrently with neglect. But children are also exposed in other ways. If parents are substance abusers or they have serious mental illness, that's often very traumatizing for children and also can lead to neglect. In addition, there's family violence, domestic violence, children witnessing parents or caregivers fighting or others in the family fighting. There's also community violence, a lot of violence that occurs in neighborhoods that children are exposed to and not protected from. And then I always talk about media violence, and in fact, with social media currently, children can easily be exposed to much more media violence as well. Parents or caregivers may not think that if they have the television on, it's showing pictures of violence, but in fact, children do see those images and are exposed to them. And so it's very important to watch children's exposure to media violence, as well as what might just be occurring in their environment. One of the things that helps for children who are exposed to media violence is to talk with them about what they've heard and try to explain it to them so it doesn't just come at them. And then children are also exposed to disasters. That's an area that I work in, both natural and technological disasters that children are exposed to. And what happens with disasters is that it's unexpected. Often they have to evacuate, they may be displaced, they may have to live in a different city or a different home. If they're a little older, go to a different school. For children in the child welfare system, they may not be able to evacuate with their foster parents, so it can cause a lot of trauma for children. And essentially, what does trauma do with young children? So children are on a path of what we call a normal developmental trajectory. I like to use the analogy of the book, The Little Engine That Could. So with this book, as we know, the train is going up the track and chugging up the track and trying to make its way. And what happens is trauma comes along and throws them off their normal developmental trajectory. And what happens at that time is we see delays in a number of different areas. We see developmental delays in cognitive development, even sometimes in motor development, that's less often, emotional and social development. And what happens with emotional and social development is there's emotion dysregulation and behavior dysregulation. Further, children learn about relationships from early relationships, and if they experience trauma early in their life, it may influence their attachment relationships. They may have more difficulty forming secure relationships with people, and early relationships form the basis of later relationships, and we may find them having difficulty forming attachments later in life too, and relationships. So it's very important to address trauma early if children are exposed. So what are some of the factors that affect the outcomes for young children? First of all, age is very important. Young children are exquisitely sensitive to parents and caregivers and their environment. They really can't cope on their own. So the younger children are more likely to be affected significantly if exposed to trauma, and also their developmental stage. They also don't have the cognitive capacity to be able to understand as well in ways that would be supportive to them. Another factor is how dangerous they feel the situation is. I've heard from parents of young children who've actually been in war zones who've been able to protect their children by somehow keeping them in an area that they were not exposed to the ongoing danger of the war. But that's really difficult. So often the perception of danger is communicated through parents or caregivers as well. Then there's also very good research indicating that how much a child is traumatized depends upon the relationship to the victim as well as the perpetrator. So for domestic violence, if it occurs within the family, these are the people who are supposed to be keeping the child safe. So domestic violence can impact very significantly. And then if the child knows the victim or the perpetrator. So there's very good research on older children that's been done by Bob Pinus in schoolyards, where the children who were most affected were those who were out in the schoolyard that day and witnessed the shooting that occurred in the schoolyard, a sniper attack in the schoolyard. The children who were affected next most were those who were in the school that day and heard about it and also spoke to their peers who had been affected. And the children who are affected less are those who were sick that day and didn't come to school for some reason, unless they know the victim or the perpetrator. So knowing the victim or the perpetrator indicates that the trauma is going to affect the child a great deal more. One of the things that we know is very important in terms of outcomes following trauma is having adults to protect the child, to help them and protect them and to explain it to them. And we also need to help adults learn how to talk to young children who are exposed to trauma. Certainly other factors impact the genetic history, previous history of trauma experience. Those children who've been exposed to trauma before are more likely to be impacted more highly by this traumatic experience. And then we also know that if there are subsequent traumatic events, that also will have a significant impact on the child over time. The other factor that we need to think more about, which I mentioned briefly before, is the parents or caregivers. How much are they traumatized? Are they able to listen to the child's stories, or do they want them to be quiet so they don't feel even more stressed by what's going on? So essentially, can they be emotionally available to the child? Can they be there to listen? Can they be there to be supportive? And certainly in domestic violence situations, other types of serious stress or trauma, or even a serious automobile accident where the parent is also injured, they may not be able to hear the child or listen to the child, or may get so stressed with the child's problems that it's hard for them to be emotionally available. So they need to protect themselves from feeling vulnerable, which also increases their traumatization. Other factors that influence how children experience trauma. I mentioned if they've been exposed to trauma before or if they're exposed to trauma after. In this particular time, it's very important to know how many traumatic experiences and the severity of the trauma, which will influence how the child experiences the trauma. In the example before, like a sniper attack in a schoolyard, how close is the child to the event? And certainly if a child is in the same school, in the same daycare, the event occurs, they're all traumatized. We had an experience a number of years ago where actually there was a domestic violence situation that had gone out into the community, and a father chased the mother into a child care center and had a gun, and all of the children were traumatized, all of the teachers were traumatized. So that related to proximity to the event, personal significance of the traumatic event, because this was a father of one of the children traumatizing a mother as she was dropping her child off for school. So it's very important to understand the context of the trauma in terms of the impact on the child. And then how much is the support system disrupted? So certainly in foster care, if there's an additional trauma, that may be difficult, but even obviously going into foster care in and of itself, it can be traumatizing for a child because they've lost their primary caretaker, they're in a situation with a stranger, and they have to adjust. With child maltreatment, again, it's the caregiver who is expected to protect them, and that can be extremely traumatizing. And then with disasters, the support system is often disrupted. There's disruption in the neighborhood. Children may have lost their homes. Extended family, and in addition to their family, may have to evacuate. So that can cause a lot of disruption after the trauma occurs. So what are the red flags, signs in the baby that emotional needs aren't being met? So for the very young child, we see often a bland affect, a child as young as 6 months old, where there's no emotional expression on the child's face. We've recently seen a family where there's been a lot of neglect, and it's not at all unusual to see bland emotion when there is neglect in the family. Lack of eye contact, as the young child make eye contact. Children in the course of normal development make eye contact very early. From the beginning of life, from the newborn period, and continue to make more eye contact during the first year. So if we see a baby who doesn't make eye contact, or a very young child, even in the first year, we should be very concerned about that. Non-organic failure to thrive, the child who isn't developing well, that's certainly a red flag. Child not being responsive. So not being able to respond, talk to them, they don't look at you, they don't talk to you, they can't respond. That's pretty unusual for children. There certainly is a period of time in the second half of the first year of life when they develop stranger anxiety and separation anxiety and may be less responsive to other people at that point, but they're certainly very responsive to their caregiver. Another red flag is preferring a stranger to a familiar caregiver. We were in a situation recently where there were several strangers and a 2-year-old child, and the 2-year-old went from one lap to another lap, showing us teddy bear and wanting to play. And one of the people who was not informed about what we're talking about today indicated that wasn't this a very friendly child, and in fact, it was of great concern for a 2-year-old to go from the lap of one stranger to another. And then not wanting to be close, not wanting to be held or touched is another red flag for a baby. For a toddler, we often see dysregulated and aggressive behaviors. The most common referral, the most common complaint that comes up in child care centers, the child's aggressive, they won't sit still, they may hit other people, and they're running around all the time dysregulated. That's a very common behavior and reaction that we see with trauma. Problems in paying attention. Again, not being able to sit still and pay attention. The example I gave of indiscriminate attachment before, a lack of attachment, and then other kinds of things, sleep problems, feeding problems, other kinds of disorders. Any behavior that's out of the ordinary, as we say, unusual for children of this age, is a red flag to pay attention to. What are the kinds of behaviors that we can observe? I already mentioned eye contact, eye-to-eye contact between a parent and caregiver and young child, or if another person comes in the room, depending on if the child could be going through stranger or separation anxiety, you ought to be able to see eye contact. That child ought to look at the parent or caregiver and even somebody else. Whether the child keeps some physical distance from the caregiver or young child, that's a red flag, because physical contact is a normal part of development, and keeping physical distance might indicate that there's a problem going on, not if they're running around and playing, but overall physical distance. Talking, smiling, other ways that they communicate with each other, that's a very important aspect to look at. Does it look like they enjoy being together? Do they talk? Do they smile? Do they play? And then a give and take. Responsiveness and reciprocity. Is there a give and take? Is there turn-taking behavior? Do they enjoy being together? Do they enjoy playing together? Do you see that responsivity and reciprocity in the relationship? And is the adult and child, the caregiver and infant, sensitive to each other? And that you can learn by observation. So essentially, we want to know, does the child have a full range of emotions and affect? Are there any signs of inadequate care, abuse, or neglect? How does the infant relate to the parent or caregiver? How does the parent or caregiver relate to the infant? And how does the infant relate to the examiner? So you can learn all this from observation in terms of seeing what their relationship looks like, if the infant approaches the caregiver and is comfortable with them, the caregiver approaches the infant and is comfortable, and then how does the infant or young child relate to the examiner? So one of the things that many people may not think about that much is, how do young children show trauma exposure? Because they can't always tell you. They don't always have the language to tell you. Certainly the young child doesn't, and even when they do have language, it may be hard for them to describe what happened to them. So there's something that we look at, and that is trauma triggers and trauma play. Play is very important in terms of understanding what's happening with a child, and play with the caregiver is particularly important. Mickey Siegel, a wonderful person in the area of infancy and early childhood development, talked about play being the language of children. So when they play, do they show signs of trauma in some ways? And I can give you some examples of that. Do they somehow have a picture of what happened to them in their mind? Or when they look at the caregiver, sometimes we do assessments after the trauma, and do they look frightened? And we certainly see that sometimes. Does a color set them off? We had a situation where a color would set off the child, or noises. If there's a siren, is that something that makes them frightened? Or smells? Are there other reminders of the event? And I'll give you some examples. So we, quite a number of years ago, saw 2-year-old twins who had witnessed the shooting death of their mother by their father, and at least one of the twins had some blood on them when all of this occurred. But in the playroom, one day we had some red Play-Doh for them to play with. They took one look at the red Play-Doh, the color, whatever, and they froze. And sometimes when children have been very traumatized, you see a freezing response. They froze. In another situation, there were kind of poles in the room, or that just to play with or build with, and they banged them against a cabinet, which seemed to mimic potentially shooting sounds. So we saw some of those triggers and repeating behaviors with the twins. We also saw a 3-year-old who had been exposed to domestic violence, and the mom was really concerned about the domestic violence, but really hadn't thought that her child was impacted. So we prepared her for the fact that you might see something in the play as the child is repeating and showing what she experienced. And the first thing the child did was come in the playroom, pick up a baby doll off the floor and put it on the roof of a house and yell, "Help, help." And the mother broke down because she was very upset seeing it. But the child didn't know that she wasn't supposed to play out what she saw and what she felt from what she saw, a little baby who needed help. We also saw in my disaster work, post-traumatic stress responses of Katrina victims being exposed to Hurricane Harvey very recently, but there certainly were post-traumatic stress responses in Katrina victims, even as Hurricane Harvey was in the Gulf of Mexico, even before it hit Texas, that there was the repeating images of what it was like with Katrina and having to evacuate and all of those types of things. And it's particularly hard, obviously, on families in Texas who had evacuated after Hurricane Katrina and lived in Texas and now were experiencing the disaster again. So I want to talk about the importance of protective factors, because we shouldn't just talk about risk factors, but also protective factors for young children when they're exposed to trauma. And we need to know that protective factors will make a difference and help the child build resilience. That is, doing okay despite the adversity. So one of the very important protective factors obviously is in the family and the caregiver, and them being able to be there for them and being emotionally available to them. They need to feel there are resources for them. They need to feel okay themselves. Family support is important, community support is important, but as Ann Masden talks about resilience, it's not something unusual, it's not something rare. She called it ordinary magic. It's if there's a supportive person there for the baby, for the young child, if they're exposed to trauma, they're probably going to be okay, a consistent supportive person. So that's a really important factor with trauma and other types of risk, is having someone there for them who can support them. So here are some of the factors that are very important in building resilience. I already mentioned a supportive person, the attachment relationship and social support. A reasonable cognitive capacity to be able to integrate what's happened and how the change is going to take place, but if there are new routines and different routines, they can adjust to them. And they're able to use their ability to understand the situation. Opportunities to learn and be effective. So this is more important in some ways for older children in being able to feel like they can make a difference after trauma, but even for younger children, being able to be effective. Feeling like I can do it and I can cope and I can manage is very important. Children who are better able to regulate their emotions and regulate their behaviors will do better in circumstances of trauma, as opposed to children who have more difficulty regulating their behaviors. So behavior and emotion regulation is a matter of both nature, which you're born with, and nurture. But some children are born with better ability to control their emotions. And then a sense of belonging or meaning in life. We came up with a notion, and others have also, of a sense of place. We found this to be really important in children's recovery after Hurricane Katrina. And we also find this important for children in child welfare who can be either quickly reunified with their biological parent or in a foster to adopt placement. So they feel a sense of place. They feel a sense of someone who's there for them and someone they can be with, which is very important in terms of recovery and resilience. Prevention programs are really important to build resilience. They can balance the risk versus the assets, and they help to build powerful systems within the individual that can help them recover. There are many strategies that promote competence and reduce problems. So the importance of early intervention combined with prevention programs, being prepared and then having some sense of how to deal with something is extremely important in terms of building resilience. You can't necessarily be prepared for some of the kinds of traumas that I've been talking about, but others you can, and then there are powerful systems that will be activated in human development. What's most important in terms of building resilience is the relationship. Healthy social and emotional development will be most effectively nurtured if there's an important person, sometimes more than one, who's there for the baby, emotionally invested in the baby, regardless of what happens. And it's very important to emphasize that who fills this role is less important than the quality of the relationship that this person establishes with the child. This was emphasized a great deal in the book Neurons to Neighborhood that was published by the National Academy of Sciences. Jack Schoenkoff and Deborah Phillips edited it, and this is a very important message related to nature and nurture. Early relationships are important in a positive way, because if a baby has a positive experience with their caregiver, then they will expect positive experiences from other caregivers, and then it's easier for them to adjust from one person to another. It's easier for them to adjust to childcare. It's easier for them to adjust to a new caregiver. So essentially, early relationships, as I mentioned before, form the basis for all later relationships. On the other hand, if the early relationship is negative, babies who have a negative experience with their caregiver will continue to have low expectations for other people, and it may be harder for them to behave in ways that elicit nurturance. Mary Dozier wrote about this cogently, related to foster care. With sensitive foster mothering, baby can still learn that their needs will be met and become securely attached, even if in the beginning they had lower expectations. So for babies, this special adult is not interchangeable, but the relationship that comes out of being with a special adult will help them in forming other attachment relationships. And babies do grieve. You see that when they're, for some reason or other, their attachment relationships are disrupted. But if they've had a good relationship, that helps them in forming future good relationships. And I guess a very important message related to early trauma and infant mental health for young children is the idea that good relationships are catching. They learn from good relationships. And as Jeree Paul, a leader in the field of infant and early childhood mental health, said, how you are is as important as what you do. So how you are with a baby is as important, or even sometimes more important, than what you do. Thank you very much.